would like to introduce our today's moderator, who will introduce our today's first speaker. So Vyacheslav Gerasimchuk, he is the Old Testament scholar and a teacher at Odessa Theological Seminary, who earned his PhD at the Carroll Theological Seminary in Texas. He also from the one of the most dangerous area in Ukraine, Odessa, and he tries to support this seminary by teaching there and working with students. So it's an honor that he is joining us today. So if we will have some internet issues, because people are joining us from the different parts in Ukraine, regions in Ukraine. So we are very sorry for that. But if something happens and the system we will have some interruptions, we're just sorry about that. But we will try to do our best. So Vyacheslav, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ksenia. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of Summer School of Theology. I know that the first day went very well, splendidly well, and I'm sure today will be just as great. You probably all know that the theme of today's session is discovering what the Bible has to say about migration. I know that it has been an important subject, for all those who study Scripture for quite a long time, but as it is today, without reference to the contemporary context, it's important. But in our time, this great regional wars and the best displacement of millions of people, it has certainly become one of the central themes of the Bible. And our speaker for this session is Dr. Daniel Carroll Rodas. Hello, Dr. Carroll. Welcome to SST, Summer School of Theology. Dr. Carroll is professor of biblical studies and pedagogy at the Wheaton College Graduate School, and his areas of expertise are the Old Testament prophets and ethics, as well as the subjects related to immigration. And his PhD is from the University of Sheffield, which is in the United Kingdom. Dr. Daniel is half Guatemalan and was raised bilingual and bicultural. I know that you, Dr. Carroll, you have 2 adult sons and 5 grandchildren, maybe more now, grandchildren. Still 5, okay. And I don't want to give too many biographical details because, I risk, get some of them wrong or reveal to Dr. Daniel something that he doesn't know about himself. I will only add one thing, that Dr. Carroll is a very prolific writer. He has authored or edited about 20 books, and some of those books are on the topics of the Bible and immigration. And I'm currently reading one of Dr. Carroll's books, The Bible and Borders, Hearing God's Word on Immigration. And I find it a very interesting, informative, and well-researched book. Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll. And before I turn the floor over to Dr. Carroll, I would like to say that all participants, you can ask questions in the chat room, listen carefully. And if you have a question, formulate it as clearly as you can and place it in the chat room. And we may not have time to voice all the questions, to ask all the questions, but we'll certainly ask some questions to the speaker. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Carroll to share what he has to say with us, what the Bible has to say about migration. Please, Dr. Carroll, it's your time.
Well, thank you. This is quite a privilege for me. I've been actually following the war very closely for the last, since it started. So to be able to speak to Ukrainians, to me is quite a privilege. And quite the challenge as well. Let me give a little more background about myself and how I got into this topic. My mother, as our brother was saying, was Guatemalan. So my mother was an immigrant, and my father was the son of immigrants from Ireland. So we were raised in this very bicultural, bilingual home. So this issue of migration is always been part of my family and my life. And then I taught in Guatemala for 13 years myself. and that's where my sons were born, and that's where we raised our children. So the immigrant experience is also a personal thing. But over the last maybe 15 years or so, I've been working with immigrants from Latin America. And in fact, on Sunday afternoons, I attend a church of immigrants, of Latin American immigrants. So this is a topic that is very dear to my heart. And in this country, in the United States, this has been a very contested topic for some time. So what I'd like to do is go on to the PowerPoint, and I have an assistant who's going to do this for me. I'm not very good with computer stuff, so she is going to be my assistant. But if we go to the title there, what I want to do is spend the time that we have this morning trying to uncover a lot about what the Bible has to say about migration. Now, if you go to the next slide, and the very first line, there's a challenge when we talk about this. And if you are in Ukraine or have migrated to a different part of Ukraine or to another country, there's a challenge that we all will face, and that is that people will argue about migration, usually for political reasons. Sometimes it becomes part of the political debate of a country. We've seen that here in the United States. Sometimes it's about the economics, how immigrants are putting different kinds of pressures on the economy of a city or the economy of a country. Sometimes it's about social issues. Can immigrants begin to accommodate and assimilate into the larger culture? Are they so different that they are a problem? Sometimes it's not only about the culture, sometimes it's about the language, it's about competition for jobs, and all these become the focus of the discussion. Now, these are things you have to get to. But what I want to say is that as Christians, we need to begin to think about this very self-consciously as Christians. And my assistant has put this verse on the screen. And oftentimes, we let the world shape how we think about these things. And I'm going to speak about the United States. So oftentimes what happens when I've talked to Christians, if they even relate the Bible to the topic, oftentimes they've already made a decision politically or socially and economically about immigration. And they go to the Bible after that to try to find verses that support their political position. And that has everything backwards. And what we have done, maybe not self-consciously, is we've let the world shape our mind and define our ethics. And all we want to do is find the verse that will support that point of view. So when you look at this verse, I've heard this verse many times in churches about not being conformed to the world. Oftentimes, when people talk about that, at least in this country, it's about sex, it's about drugs or something like that. And that's very important. But we also need to be careful about being conformed to the world ideologically and politically, because that's very common in the history of the Christian church. So what I want to do today is spend some time trying to establish the biblical foundation and then move back into the socio-political and economic discussion. So this, for me, is a constructive way to start. So that would be the next point. If we begin with the politics, we will just argue. We will take different points of view and we'll appeal to different statistics or things like that. And oftentimes, that's not a very constructive conversation. It's more of an argument. What I want to do today is to build a biblical point of view, and that way it would be a constructive point. But there's another issue that's very key for this, and that would be the next point on the screen. When I speak to people in churches and universities and seminaries about immigration, and the church I go to on Sunday afternoons, what I see are multiple audiences. Now, what do I mean by that? If I'm speaking to a church in the United States that's made up of citizens, what I'm trying to do is show them how immigration is in the Bible. From Genesis to Revelation, the Bible is full of migration. And the reaction that I often get from audiences that are citizens are like, wow, we didn't know all that was in the Bible. Well, yes, it's all over the place in the Bible. And we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But there's another point that's very it's important. So this is before I get to the last one. So my assistant's jumping ahead of me, but that's okay. And this is important, I think, for those of you in Ukraine. The Bible gives its message not only to the receiving of immigrants, but it also is a message to immigrants themselves. Now, what I mean by that is this. Once you go into the Bible, and we'll spend most of our time in the Old Testament, I'm an Old Testament professor, is that you will begin to see your stories in the biblical stories. Now the Bible will accompany you in your journey as immigrants. Now you will begin to see that God has a special heart for immigrants. So what I find as I speak to different kinds of audiences is that they will hear a different message. For some, it will be the importance of receiving immigrants. And for the other audience, they will hear the message that God has always been with immigrants from the beginning of time. Now, if you look at human history is truly the history of migration. You go back to the ancient world, it's about people moving. And that's been true in any part of the world since the beginning of time. So it's not surprising that the Bible will spend a lot of time talking about migration. This is very much of a human experience of every country in the world, in the history of the world. So this is what we're going to be looking at. At the same time, we have to realize that there are some limitations of the biblical material. Now, what I mean by that is this. If you remember, we began by talking about how people will argue over politics, economics, social frameworks, healthcare, national security, all these things which are important topics. Those are policy issues, and that will depend on the country. What the Bible will not give us is policy. Policy changes over time. Policy changes over country, cultures, systems, and things like this. So the Bible won't give us the policy. What it will give us is a moral compass and some spiritual foundations from which we can then begin to talk about policy. And now that becomes a framework from which to evaluate and propose policy. So we're going to be looking at those spiritual, ethical foundations so that we can begin to talk about those things afterward in whatever country you might find yourself. So let's go to the next slide. One of the ways that we can see how important migration is in the Bible is that it actually becomes a metaphor for Christian faith. Now, I sent an outline to, is it Ksenia? How do you pronounce your name? You pronounce the K, Ksenia. Okay. I sent her an outline, and I think she said that the outline is in the chat box or something like that. So you will see the biblical passages, and we won't turn to them. I just wanted you to have them. But here's the point. When we go to these passages, we begin to see that the Bible will tell us that all of us are sojourners. All of us are strangers in a strange land. And if we begin to look around us, and this would be true in Ukraine, the world is a very strange place. And this isn't our primary kingdom. We have another king. We have another citizenship. We are strangers in a very strange land. So what you begin to see is migration has become a metaphor of what it means to be a Christian. Now, this is important, and when I speak to Latino churches, I will say this. Immigrants understand what it means to be strange. They're in a strange place. They may not speak the language. They may not know the customs. The food is different. What you wear is different. How you greet one another is different. You feel very strange. Well, that's what it should mean as a Christian. And so what you begin to see is that immigrants actually can teach us how to be better Christians, because they will understand in their very life what it means to be strange. So as we begin to think about this, how do we begin the conversation? So we need to find a constructive place to begin the conversation. Now, what happens in this country is that oftentimes when Christians begin to talk about migration or immigration, they want to go to Romans 13 and talk about legality. I don't know how it is in Europe, but in this country, oftentimes Christians, especially citizen Christians, want to go to Romans 13. Why don't they do this the right way? They need to obey the laws. The law doesn't contemplate this many immigrants, and it becomes very much of a legal discussion. But what I tell people when I talk about this is I say, Romans 13 is about on page 1000 in my book, in my Bible. Why don't we begin on page 1? And then you can get to Romans 13, but you have 1,000 pages before it that will teach us how to read it. So this is why I would turn to Genesis 1 and 2, especially those verses that appear on the screen right now. Because what it tells us is that we are all made in the image of God. Now, for Christians, we would go, oh, of course that's true. But I want us to look more carefully. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it and rule. So what we begin to see here is that these verses will teach us, and this is the next point there, to recognize that the starting point of the discussion with immigration is not legality, it's humanity. And we begin to see that not only do immigrants have value because they are made in the image of God, and many Christians would say, oh yes, that's true. But there's another point that's important once you get to the legislation discussions, is that what you begin to see is that all humans can subdue and rule the earth. What this tells us is that all humans have potential. All humans have gifts. All humans have skills. And now you begin to see that the immigrant is not only a burden that we have to deal with, but immigrants now can bring value into a society. They bring all their gifts, they bring all their potential, they bring all their energy. And now if you begin to appreciate that among immigrants, it will even change how you think about legislation, because now it's not about how to control and limit and stop immigration. It's about how can we facilitate all the potential of the immigrants into national life. For instance, in this country, there's been a big discussion about young people who've come in with their parents. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children of immigrants that are now in colleges and in high schools. But they don't have legal status because of the way that this country does immigration law. But now you would begin to talk about how can we give these young people legal status to work so that they can actually contribute with all of their gifting to the national good. And you've changed the whole tone of the immigration discussion. You've changed the whole focus of the legal discussion. You've changed the whole focus of the assimilation discussion, because now you're seeing the value and the potential of all immigrants. Let's go to the next slide, because what we're going to do now is we're going to look at just how full the Old Testament is of immigration stories, not only immigration law. So the first one is Abram, who becomes Abraham. Now, all of us would know that Abram is called in Genesis 12, 1-3. And this is not on this slide, but it's in the notes. If you step back and look at those verses, God is calling Abram to migrate. to a place he does not know, to a people he does not know, to a language he does not know. And the father of the faith begins to migrate. He migrates up to Haran, which today would be on the Turkish-Syrian border, and then he comes south into Canaan. But then what you see is that the migration will continue because he and Sarai will then go to Egypt because they're hungry, looking for food. Now, what we begin to see here is how migration is built on human need. So even the patriarch, Abram, and his wife Sarai are hungry, and so they go to Egypt looking for food. Now, there's an interesting story here because, as you know, when he comes to Egypt, he will lie. Now, let's set up the scene here. We know from archaeology that the Egyptians always had water because of the Nile. So people would always be coming in during times of famine because there would be crops and there would be harvest in Egypt when other places there would be hunger. So Egypt was always wrestling in the ancient world with people coming in looking for food. And Abram and Sarai are following a pattern that Egypt was very familiar with. So what Egypt had done is they had set up a series of checkpoints and of forts along their eastern frontier to monitor the people coming in. This sounds very much like today, doesn't it? So as Abram comes to the border, what he does, maybe to one of these checkpoints, is he lies. If they ask you, tell them that you're my sister and not my wife. He lies. And she's willing to go along with it. She is willing, literally, to sacrifice her body because the threat would be for her to go into Pharaoh's harem. She is willing to sacrifice that so that they can eat. So what you're seeing is a very traumatic immigrant story by Abram and his wife from the very beginning. And then they'll migrate eventually back into Canaan. But what we're beginning to see is how central migration is to the very story of the people of God. Now, there's one thing on your notes that's not on the screen, but it's very important. When you look at Genesis 12, 1-3, in the call of Abram, this is the beginning. I think you had Chris Wright yesterday, correct? A good friend and a great missiologist, an Old Testament scholar too. But you have, with the call of Abram, really the foundation of the mission of the people of God to be a blessing to the world. But what you see is that the call to be a blessing is given to a migrant. The call to bless the nations of the world is given to a migrant people. And again, you begin to see how this could change how we think about migration. And actually what you find worldwide, and I think you might have like Jehu Hansels and people like this coming later on, is that what you're seeing around the world are diaspora churches. I think I saw one person who was introduced at the beginning that works with Ukrainian churches in the United States. Well, what you have in the United States are all these diaspora communities that are doing ministry in cities in the United States. They are doing mission. They are propagating the faith and discipling people. This is what the people of God do when they migrate. And this goes back all the way back to Abram. Migrants become a hand of blessing to the world. The next Old Testament character that I want to mention is Joseph. This is a fascinating story because what you have with Joseph also is migration. But it's not because he wanted to. It's not because he needed to. His brothers actually sold him into slavery, and then he goes into Egypt. But this is a very good migrant. He works hard, and he's honest. He's very moral, and his morality actually gets him in trouble because the wife of Potiphar, his master, tries to seduce him, and he runs away. So if you look at the biblical story, who do the Egyptians blame? Do they blame the Egyptian woman, or do they blame the migrant? Well, they blame the migrant, the foreigner. And so he's the one who goes to jail. Now, you know the story, so I'm not going to repeat the story. He interprets the dreams and he comes out. And now he's number 2 in Egypt. But here's the point that I want to make. He is given, when he comes out, he's given an Egyptian wife. And now he's in the government, right? So he's very privileged, and now he has an Egyptian wife. But when they have two sons, he gives them Israelite names. So he hasn't forgotten his roots. They have Israelite names. Now, when his family comes, his brothers, you know that story. First his brothers, and eventually his father will also come. They come looking for food. There it is again, the need to eat. Now, there's a scene there that's very powerful. When they come to him, uh, they don't recognize their brother. They don't recognize Joseph, but he recognizes them. Well, that's kind of a strange thing, but it actually isn't. Because at that time in Egypt, a man of his stature in the government would have shaved everything, and he would have painted his face, worn very fancy clothes, and probably some kind of hat or something, you know, for his status in society. So they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. But here's the point too. He understands what they're saying. He uses an interpreter, but he understands what they're saying. And he goes behind the curtain and he weeps. And the point is this, is that he has not forgotten his mother tongue. He still speaks his language. And that's so much of the immigrant experience. I was raised bilingual. I go to a Latino church. I speak Spanish every week. This is part of who I am. I cannot not speak Spanish. If I want music, if I want romantic music with my wife, it's got to be in Spanish. English isn't as romantic as Spanish. Okay. But the point is the language. And then eventually his father will come. And the text tells us that the Egyptians despised shepherds. And what was his father? A shepherd. And he introduces his father, the old shepherd, to the Pharaoh. Was Joseph embarrassed? Was it hard for him to admit to Pharaoh that he came from a shepherd background? And what you see in Genesis is this old man blesses Pharaoh. And what you find is that this shepherd, this migrant, this poor, hungry old man blesses the most powerful man in the world at the time. Again, the power of migration. Now, what you also will see in the next point there, that there's a whole, we've already talked about patriarchs and mission, but there's a whole series of foreigners that are part of the people of God in the Old Testament. So that should be, there you go. And so I won't go through these. You will see in your notes that you were sent or that you can access a whole list of foreigners who were part of the people of God. Now, there's a couple of things there that I want to mention. So I won't go through all those. And it's this. On the one hand, in those stories that I list for you, you will see there are cases where foreigners are taken in by the people of God. So that's an important equation too. See, how do other believers receive foreigners? Okay, that's what you can see in the Old Testament. How do the people of God receive people from the outside? That's one kind of story. The other kind of story is when the people of God themselves are the outsiders. So you have, and we'll get into the law a little bit later, about story after story after story of all these foreigners that have come in. And they're sometimes they're good stories, and sometimes they're not good stories. There's some very tragic stories about how the people of God treated foreigners. Let me just mention one that's a really sad story, and this is David and Bathsheba. Her husband is Uriah. I don't know how you pronounce Uriah in Ukraine, but Uriah. He was one of David's mighty men. That means he was one of the 30 chosen warriors to guard David. So he was loyal. And these 30 men would have given their life to David. And his name, Uriah in Hebrew, means Yah or Yahweh, God, is my light. So it's clear that Uriah not only was a Hittite who was a foreigner who had pledged his allegiance unto death for David, he had come to believe in the God of Israel. So you see this man who was very much committed to the people of God and is part of the people of God, but the people of God, in this case, in the person of David, does an awful thing and has him killed. So there's good stories and there's some bad stories in the Old Testament. The next story that I want to mention is Naomi and Ruth, and this is one that I think everyone would know. But let me just mention a couple of scenes here that maybe we haven't thought about. If you remember the story, Naomi and her husband and two sons are immigrants to Moab. There's a famine in the land. There's hunger again. They cross the Dead Sea to the other side of the Jordan, and they go into Moab, and the sons marry Moabite women. Now, Naomi's husband will die, and the sons will die, and now Naomi says, I want to go back home. I hear things are better there. And the two daughters-in-law will say, we will go with you. And she tries to tell them not to come, but eventually Ruth will come. And now Ruth, who had married an immigrant, Naomi's son, now Ruth will become the immigrant back into Bethlehem of Judah. But here's the interesting story part. In Ruth chapter 1, when she says that very famous line, I will go with you, your God will be my God, your people, my people, your land, my land, and I will die with you. If you look at the story, Naomi says nothing. Does she accept this? Does she even want this? And when she gets back to Bethlehem at the end of chapter 1, the women of the town come out and they're all crying and they're all hugging each other. Naomi doesn't mention Ruth at all. And Naomi will say, I'm a bitter woman. Yahweh has taken everything from me. And where did that happen? In Moab. And now she has a Moabite daughter-in-law with her. A reminder of everything that she's lost. So Ruth isn't even mentioned. Was she standing in a corner by herself, awkward, the foreigner that no one wanted? And so when you read the book of Ruth, what you see is how this woman works so hard to become part of the community of Bethlehem. And when you get, and there's all kinds of other stories I could tell, but I can't because of time. But when you get to chapter 4, Boaz, will marry Ruth. And the men of the town will say, oh, this is an amazing woman. And she's just like the great women of our history. And then the women who had ignored Ruth at the beginning will go to Naomi because now Ruth she's had a son. And she says, they say to Naomi, this woman loves you more than 7 sons. And then you read the text, and Naomi says nothing. She doesn't say, yes, she's been loyal and she's worked hard. Oh, I love that woman. Nothing, not a word. And they hand the little boy to Naomi. And they say, this little one will take care of you when you get old. And she takes the boy. So maybe now Naomi will truly accept her Moabite daughter-in-law. So do you see the intercultural dynamics? And the boy is called Obed. And Obed becomes the ancestor of David. So from this poor peasant immigrant woman will come the greatest king of Israel. But there's something else that I want to mention. Obed is half Israelite, half Moabite. He's a mix. And that's what I am. I'm half Guatemalan and I'm half American. I'm half and half. And as you begin to migrate, as some of you begin to migrate, and you see your children maybe marry foreigners, you will repeat the story of Ruth and Naomi, and you'll have a generation of Obids. And maybe they will become another David. The next one is Jeremiah. Jeremiah experiences war, as some of you have experienced, sadly. And thousands and thousands die in the war. Babylon was cruel. And Babylon deported forcefully people by the thousands. They would have walked hundreds of miles. We know from archaeology that some of them worked hard labor. Babylon would be in what is today southeastern Iraq with the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And they used the water from the rivers to irrigate that part of the world. So we know from archaeology that some of those who were exiled into Babylon worked the canals, digging them. Some apparently did okay. We have archaeological evidence of communities of exiles. So it all sounds very familiar, doesn't it? But what he tells them is this. He tells them in Jeremiah chapter 29, we won't read it, but he tells them to invest in where they are, that they're going to be there a long time. And they need to have their children marry. They need to work their farms and build their homes. So he basically tells them they have to get on with life, which is hard. Oftentimes when people migrate, the first instinct is to survive. And so you tend to cluster, which is very natural, in your communities of the same language and faith and customs and food. But eventually you have to invest into the life, into the place you are. And he tells them to do that. But then he says to pray for the well-being of Babylon. And what you're seeing, what he's telling them to do is not only to flourish in exile, but to be a blessing to the place that they have been taken to, even though it's a place they did not want to go to. So again, lessons for us. The next one will be Daniel, Ezekiel, and Esther. Oh, there's so many stories here. I'm watching my time. I love telling these stories. Let me do Daniel very quickly, and I just do a little bit. You know the story, so I have to assume you know your Bible. So in Daniel chapter 1, he's been taken away with his friends, and they're very well educated. Okay, so we know from archaeology that maybe 10% of the population could read and write, probably less than that. So these are well-educated young men. They probably come from wealthy backgrounds. So they are taken away. And it says in the beginning verses of the chapter that they're taken away, and Jerusalem has not fallen yet. Okay, that's important. But they've ransacked the temple, and what that would do in the ancient world, it would communicate that the God of Babylon was more powerful than the God of Judah. So what you find as you read chapter 1 is that these young men had lost everything. They watched Jerusalem fall from hundreds and hundreds of miles away. They would have known that their family would have been killed. Everything that they owned, their social status, their homes, whatever property they had, was gone, destroyed. Their God in their mind had been defeated. They even changed their names. And the names that they are given are connected to Babylonian gods. And so even their new names are blasphemy. And they educate them. And in the ancient world, the education was largely based on religious texts. So even the curriculum of their education is blasphemy. And what was their reaction? I mean, they had lost everything. Their families had been killed. Their friends had been killed. Everything destroyed. They'd been humiliated. And now the empire wants them, these young men, to serve the very empire that destroyed them. That almost sounds like Ukraine and Russia, doesn't it? The thing is that they have no room to negotiate. They can't negotiate the name change. They can't negotiate the curriculum. They can't negotiate where they are. The only thing they can negotiate is their food. And we know food is a cultural marker. Different cultures eat different things. And of course, in Jewish law, Israelite law, the food was very much of a cultural marker. But what we see when you get to the end of the story, well, they are better than the conquering empire, that they are smarter than the Babylonians and better, which is a whole nother way of applying this passage. They can say, you know, you can take away our names and our friends and our family and everything we owned, but we are still Jews. We have our food, we have our faith. So even though they have nothing, they have a very rich anchor for their life. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, they're all in exile, and they have different experiences in the exile. And so that was the point I wanted to make here. I just need to keep going because you'll have different people in exile, which is the Ukrainian experience. Many of you are in exile. But you'll have a variety of experiences, some good, some bad. And that's what we find in the Bible. And with Ezra and Nehemiah, what you have is people going back, which is a whole nother discussion, which we don't have time to get into. But when you talk about migration, it's not only a migration out, sometimes it's a migration back. And all the tensions of migrating back to your homeland is what you're seeing with Ezra and Nehemiah. And that's a whole nother discussion. Let's just go to the law. Let me do that just because of time. Old Testament legislation. Here, I want to talk about the context of the giving of the law, the narratival context. And this is what I want to say here. A couple things. One is what you have in Exodus chapter 1 is, and this is very human too, but this is why it's important, is that the Egyptians are afraid of the Israelites. Why? Because there's so many of them. That's what we have here in this country, and I would assume in Europe. Well, when I was in Europe earlier this summer, there's a backlash. There is a reaction against immigrants now in parts of Europe. Why? The numbers. See, and so what you have with Egypt is they're worried about the numbers. And if you look at what the text says in Exodus chapter 1, they're worried that when these men, the boys and the men, will grow up, that they will become a national security threat. So this is why they want to eliminate the little boys when they're born. So what you're seeing is what we have today is a reaction against foreigners out of fear, and then very strict laws to somehow control that foreign population, especially the population of the men and the boys. Now, what you have with Egypt, and this would be true of any country in the world, and some of you are experiencing this, every culture, every country constructs its world. The language you speak, your customs, your food, how you dress, how you greet one another, how you do family, how you do Christmas, how you do Easter. Each country will do it differently. It's a whole world that for you is normal. And when you go into a different world, a different country, now all that's changed. And you have to learn how to live in a different way of thinking about life itself. This is important Because what God will do is he will take them out of Egypt with all of its world, with its Pharaoh, with its laws, with its armies, with its customs, with its foods, and he will take them into the desert, into the middle of nowhere, and he will give them a law that will create a different kind of society. So when you look at Old Testament law, it's not just about sacrifice for sin. That's an important part of it. It's about what do you do with murder? How do you marry? Whom do you marry? How do you raise your children? What do you do with theft? What do you do with inheritance law? What do you do? What do you eat? What do you wear? All of that, how you treat your animals, all of that is in the law. The law is offering them a different way of organizing and living their life. And this is why the immigration laws are important in the law, because what the law is communicating is we will not treat the foreigner as the Egyptians treated us. We will treat our poor people differently. We will treat our foreigners differently. We are a different kind of people. Now, when you look at the ancient world, what you have is the vulnerability of the outsider. Israel was an agrarian community, mostly peasants and farmers. Now, if you are a peasant, what you need is land to raise your crops. What do foreigners not have? Land. Also in the ancient world, there was no government to take care of them. There were no hospitals. There were no social services. So any help had to come from your family, your extended family. But what happens if you're a foreigner in the ancient world? You do not have extended family. So you are vulnerable. You are depending on Israel and the Israelites to help you. And what you find, and this will be the next point, is a whole series of provisions in the law to take care of the foreigner. And now, if you go to the notes that I sent, you will see a whole list of provisions for the foreigner. Let me just go through these very quickly, and you can look up the verses as you have time. Labor, rest. The foreigner can rest on the Sabbath. What happens oftentimes with foreign labor? We take advantage of them, and they work every day of the week. And wages, you will pay the foreigner, the law says, on time and a fair wage. What happens with the foreigner oftentimes, again, I'm speaking of the United States, is you don't pay them on time, and you hire them because you can pay them less than you do the nationals. And what you're saying is God says, we will not treat the foreigner that way. The justice in the legal system. What is one of the greatest fears a foreigner has? If the foreigner has to go to court, you don't know how the law works. You don't know the language of the law, the fear of the legal system as a foreigner. And the Old Testament will say, you will treat the foreigner in the legal system just like a native born. The law will provide food because one of the greatest needs of foreigners, especially at the beginning, is to eat. And eventually it will include them in the worship. The most precious thing of Israel now is open to the foreigner. And then that very famous verse that Jesus will quote about loving your neighbor. Well, in that same chapter in Leviticus 19, you're to love the outsider, the foreigner, as yourself, which is interesting because that's the neighbor who is hardest to love, is one who is different from you. And there's some expectations for the outsider as well, and you can look at that. Now, the question then becomes, well, let me go. I'm just looking at this. Uniqueness, do the uniqueness part. Yeah. So what I want to mention there is just this, quickly. There is no other ancient law that has anything like Old Testament law. There is no ancient law code that is anything comparable to what the Old Testament law has. The Old Testament law about immigration is unique in the ancient world, and that should teach us something. So now the next point there, the point would then become, well, why take care of the foreign? Why should we worry about the foreign? Well, the Old Testament will give you two reasons: historical memory and the person of God. Now, what I have done in this PowerPoint is include some pictures. So let's do the first picture. Now, listen before I explain this. When I speak to audiences about immigration, it can be a very emotional kind of thing. Some people have a natural aversion to the foreigner for all kinds of reasons. So what I have done, I'll show you 3 slides. These are American slides from the 19th century, over 100 years ago, and I do that on purpose. Because what I can point them to are things in the past. So the emotional dynamic will be different. It's objective, it's far away and a long time ago, but the same things are happening today. The first immigration law in the United States, and I won't go into all the history, was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which kept almost all the Chinese out of the United States. And there were reasons for this, which I won't go into. But look at the picture. You see, there's a wall. There was no wall at that time, but it's a metaphorical wall to try to keep the Chinese out. And one has just gotten over the wall, and they've pushed the ladder off the wall so that no more Chinese can get in. Okay? Now, in the United States, there is actually a wall that is being built on the southern border. Okay? So this isn't new, the idea of rejecting the foreigner and building a wall. Next slide. Now, my father was the son of Irish immigrants. And look at what this Irishman is called. This is from about 1890. The Irish Frankenstein. Would Ukrainians know about Frankenstein? You do, okay. So you can see how the Irish immigrant is being portrayed. He's an animal. He's violent. So he has a knife in one hand that's dripping blood. He has a gun in the other hand. This is the Irishman. Well, this is my grandfather. So what you're so I will ask an audience, how many of you come from Irish backgrounds? And a bunch of people will raise their hands, but they don't know the story. See, they have forgotten the history. Next slide. In the United States, there is the idea that the United States is a country of immigrants. Well, that's true, but so is every country in the world. But that's what we say. And look at this is the White House is in the background. And then you have the United States of America, and I don't know if you can see it, but it says admittance free. Walk in, welcome. But then Uncle Sam, who's the symbol of the U.S. government, is holding his nose. And the immigrant who's coming in looks like an Eastern European Jew. You see the nose and the yarmulke on the back? So he's an Eastern European Jew, and he's bringing poverty and disease, and he's bringing anarchy, and he's bringing Sabbath desecration. So here it is. On the one hand, welcome, we love immigrants, admittance free. On the other hand, you hold your nose. And this is the story of the United States. You welcome, but you don't want them. And this becomes maybe the story of any country in the world. The U.S. has used immigrant labor since the founding of the Republic. And oftentimes we want their labor, we might enjoy their food, we just don't want them. And this is the contradiction. But this is why you see the importance of historical memory. Don't forget. Over and over in the law, it'll say, don't forget that once we were slaves in Egypt, once we were foreigners in Egypt, we will never forget. And what happens in this country, in many countries of the world, is that we forget. Next slide. And because we forget, we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. This passage is very important. So if you can put that Deuteronomy passage on. Now, I won't read the whole passage because of time, but if you look at the darker areas, it says that God loves the sojourner, the foreigner, the immigrant, giving him food and clothing. So God says, to his people. Love the sojourner, for you are sojourners in Egypt. So when people say, why should I love the immigrant? My answer is because God does. I can't give you a better answer than that. God does. And God says he gives the immigrant food and clothing. How does God do that? Through his people and through the law that we just went through. Now, here's my quandary. I'm looking at the time. So can you give me a sense of how much time I have?
Well, Danny, you have about maybe 10 minutes at most. Let's have some time for questions as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so let me just, if you can put the New Testament stuff on there. Yeah, so just put all of it on there. And let me just do one last thing, and you can look at the verses that I leave there. Let me just talk about the Good Samaritan. Is that what you call that parable in Ukrainian? Do you call it the Good Samaritan? Okay. Oftentimes, this is in Luke 10, we misunderstand the parable because we say we should take care of vulnerable people just like the Samaritan did the Jew, but we miss the point. The point of the story is this. A teacher of the law asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, you need to love the Lord your God with all your power and strength and might and mind, everything. And the man responds, well, I already do that. And so Jesus says, I need to love your neighbor as yourself. And the question is, well, who's my neighbor? That's what he asks. Who is the person I'm supposed to love? If you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, well, who's my neighbor? That's what he asks. And so he tells him the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, I assume everyone knows how that parable goes, so I'm not going to repeat it. But what Jesus does is this. He says, who is the neighbor of the man that was robbed? Well, the neighbor was a Samaritan. Now, if you know how things were in the culture of first century Palestine at the time, the Jews and Samaritans hated each other. And there'd been over a century of problems between the Jews and the Samaritans at the time. So he says, who was the neighbor? Well, the neighbor was a Samaritan. So when he asks the teacher of the law, well, who was the neighbor? He can't even say Samaritan. He goes, oh, the man who took care of the other man. And then Jesus says, well, you need to be like the Samaritan. Be like the one you hate. The neighbor is the one you hate. The one who is different. That's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, which is just what Leviticus 19 says in the second part of that passage, to love the foreigner. So Jesus doesn't really give teaching about immigration directly, but a lot of what he says fits the importance of the topic. And the early church wrestles with all these cultures. Why does Paul have to say there's neither Jew nor Greek? Well, because there are problems between Jews and Greeks in the churches. It's hard to accept those who are different from us. Okay, my time is up. I could have gone for another hour, but anyway, my time's up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll, for a very illuminating lecture. We have some questions, and because we have very little time, so I will go straight away to questions. I'm going to ask my question first, and then I will ask some of the questions.
That's not fair. The moderator gets to ask the first question.
Okay, I'm gonna be last. Let's start with something that's already. Yeah, Good point. Good point. And well taken. Let's start with the question that arrived, one of the first. So from Elizabeth. I'm gonna read it verbatim. So this is what she's asking. In what ways does the biblical motive of migration, exemplified in the narrative of Abraham's calling, Israel's exodus, and the Babylonian exile, reveal a theological dialectic between divine particularity and universal scope? And how might this dialectic inform a Christian theology of place, identity, and interreligious encounter in the context of global displacement?
Oh, my word.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
That's a whole course.
Yeah.
I would say this to simplify it, because some of the speakers who are coming after me will be getting to the very topic you're interested in. So I've looked at some of the names, I know some of their work, and so that they will hit it much more deeply. What I was trying to communicate was immigrants who are believers should begin to maybe rethink their status within the mission of the people of God. That as we, well, even, I didn't get to it because of time. Even Matthew 28, the Great Commission, he is calling his church to migrate into the world to make disciples. I mean, so it becomes the idea of a particular people with a universal message. And the way we can accomplish that is in our migration. Now, that can be, like, I was a missionary in Guatemala for 15 years. It may be because you've been forced out because of war. It may be because you're forced out because of hunger. All of these different ways. But what God is doing is, through a particular people, in particular circumstances, he is spreading them, and he's done this throughout history. In fact, Jehu Hansel's, one of his most recent books, talks about this, that one of the greatest motors of world evangelization has always been diaspora communities. And so I think what I'm trying to do, and I may not be answering your question, is to begin to reframe and rethink so that migration is not only about being a victim, which it is. I don't want to minimize that. But it also is a call to a particular kind of mission that only migrants can do and appreciate. So a particular people on a universal stage with a universal message for the nations of the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. At least three questions can be grouped together into one, and it's about the current political landscape in the United States that seems to go against what the Bible has to say about treating foreigners. How do you explain this contradiction between the seemingly conservative stance of the president and his anti-immigration policy? Can you say something about this? I know it's it's getting political, but probably have your opinion.
You have to get to it. In fact, in September, I'm going to spend a whole morning with the Latino church talking about the Bible and immigration. So, yeah. I'd say a couple things. One is, one of the reasons why I show those slides is that this isn't new. This anti-immigrant feeling isn't new. I mean, so in this country, you have people who are very politicized and go, oh, this is so terrible, it's never been this way. Actually, it's been worse than now.
Yeah, agreed.
The history of this country is not only the receiving of immigrants, but the rejection of immigrants, and actually the expulsion of immigrants. That is not new. So one of the things that we have to do in this country is get an historical perspective. One that people don't talk about is under Obama, over 2 million people were deported. No one talks about that because everyone hates Trump so much. But so this isn't new. That'd be the first thing. But this is where I have to confront in love those who would side with the anti-immigrant feelings, which I don't think are biblical. At the same time, one has to be aware of the challenges of trying to integrate millions of people that came in under the last administration. So I have to appreciate the logistics of it, but the tone of it is what is disturbing. I have to admit that there are some bad immigrants, murderers, rapists. Okay. So you have to be honest with reality. The reality is it's a logistical nightmare with our schools, hospitals, all that. It's a logistical nightmare because of the criminal element within the immigrant population, as in any population. So what I have to do when I talk about that is to be realistic, but at the same time push the biblical mandate. So it takes some wisdom, because you don't want to, if you make it too easy on the left or the right, you've politicized the conversation. And the Bible is not naive about people. All of us are sinners. So the Bible's not naive about that. So in the Bible, you've got some bad immigrants, like Jezebel. Okay, she's not good, and she's a foreigner in power. So you've got bad ones and you've got good ones. You've got the Uriahs and you've got the Jezebels. That's the reality of life, and that's the reality of the world. But in the midst of that, God's people have a calling. And so this is what I want to communicate: a realistic biblical message, not some idealistic left or right message, which is what this country will tend to go to.
Thank you. I wish we could have a kind of proper conversation instead of just having a Q&A, but because we have so many questions, I will go straight to the questions. And, Christina is asking this question: would there be a difference in perception of immigrants between a large country like US, Russia, China, biblical Egypt, or Babylon, and a small country, like Ireland, Latvia, or biblical Israel, for instance?
That's a great question. I think there's several factors, because a small country can only absorb so many people, all right? And in Ireland, for instance, I know there's been a lot of Polish immigration into Ireland. So when you have a smaller population in a smaller area, you're going to feel it more. And with the European Union, there'd be more movement in ways that is different than coming into the United States. So I would say yes. The numbers will be different. The resources will be different. The impact will be different. This country has 350 million people. Well, that's a big population. And so you can have millions of people come in and they really don't impact the culture so much. A smaller country would. And one last thing that I should mention, which is unique maybe to the United States. We've had millions of Latin Americans come up to the US, and these are from a Catholic environment. So they come in with a sense of Christianity, and we actually have tens of thousands of Latino churches across the country. So the Latinos are actually helping the numbers of every denomination and the Catholic Church in this country. That's different, let's say, if you go to France. And I was in France earlier this summer, where you have a major influx of Muslims. Okay, that's a different dynamic. So, or Germany. So you've got all these kind of, again, realistic challenges that are country specific that one would need to get to.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from Edwin. I want to combine them into one. So let's hear what he has to say. According to the Torah, it is fine to put limits to immigration rather than to keep open doors for everyone that want to come to our countries. And should immigrants that come to our countries submit to our laws and culture, or allow them to live according to their own laws? Well, the second question is probably more easy to answer, but again.
Yeah, one thing that I didn't touch, it's in the notes. So if you go to the notes under the law, what you find in the Old Testament, excuse me, their expectations for the outsider. And I think those are fair. You know, in ancient Israel, if an outsider came in, they would have to eventually learn the language and the customs and things like that. So, one can say that needs to be done. The process of doing it is what's the challenge. So that would have to be, depending on the country, through the schooling system, social services, the answer is yes. At the same time, the next question is how.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll be very specific to the city and the country and the culture. Some cultures are necessarily not very welcoming. Other cultures are much more welcoming. So all those dynamics will have to come into play. The thing that worries me sometimes is that people say, oh, they don't adjust to the culture and therefore they're bad. I mean, that's kind of what you see in this country. But what they forget is that in this country, again, I can't speak with much knowledge of other countries. When immigrants came in, like the Polish people here in Chicago, the largest population of Polish people outside of Poland is in Chicago, where I am. Okay, and there are Polish neighborhoods still that speak Polish, and that's all they speak. Okay, there are Russian neighborhoods, there's Latino neighborhoods. The country has always been wrestling with this. And there are major denominations that came into the United States, for instance, the Swedish Baptists. Well, the first generation of Swedish Baptists only spoke Swedish. And it wasn't until the second generation that they began to use English in their worship services. So what you're seeing is the movement of an immigrant people into another country is usually a multi-generational process that's very normal. Okay? And we kind of want them to do it now. And that doesn't happen. And if you go back, whoever you are, to your ancestors, whether it was one generation, two generations, three generations ago, that's how they started. And it took them a generation or two to become part of the fabric of the society. So we need to be realistic about the process, which can be multi-generational. And we need to be realistic about the mechanisms that we need to put into place to help that process along.
Thank you. Dr. Carroll, in the Old Testament, one of the main arguments for treating foreign residents in a kind of non-oppressive way goes like this: because you well know how it feels to be an alien, since you were once aliens yourselves in the land of Egypt. So the historical memory of the exile is the foundation, for a very specific ethical approach to, foreigners dwelling in the country. But how about those who don't have this foundation they can rely on, this historical foundation? What do you recommend? What would you say to them?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand your question.
In the Bible, in the Old Testament, you have this very specific historical incident. Since you were once aliens, you should treat, aliens in a very non-oppressive way.
Okay, I get it.
This is a specific, moment given to a specific nation, to Israel. The rest of the country, the rest of us, what would you say about, about them?
Well, I'd say a couple of things, and then I'll use the Bible as an example. So what you find in the Old Testament, I go to Deuteronomy, because it's only that first generation that experienced the Exodus, for instance. Okay. So they were the only ones who had the living historical memory. But then it says, you shall repeat this to your children. You should never forget the story, even if it wasn't your story. It's the story of our people. And I think that's what we need to appreciate. If the Old Testament is very realistic in the sense that it recognizes that after that first generation, people forget. And once they forget, they fall into bad patterns. Now, this is why I show those slides from the 19th century in the United States. We have forgotten how we treated the Chinese. We have forgotten how we treated the Irish. We have forgotten how we treated the Eastern European Jews. We have forgotten all those stories And because we have forgotten them, the history of rejection keeps getting repeated. So the Old Testament's very aware of this. And so the Old Testament's saying, you need to repeat the stories. You need to know your history. And so I think that's what we need to begin to appreciate as well, is that we need to teach the stories. Now, what's complicated nowadays is with so many different kinds of people coming together, you're going to have the clash of stories. But what I have found when I talk to Latinos, for instance, is that even though there's something like 25 different countries in Latin America, okay, is that even though there's different stories because they're different countries, there are some shared experiences that they all understand. And so that's where, again, it's culturally specific and context specific, but I think it's important to realize that the Old Testament understands this as well. And it put into place in its very liturgical life, historical memory, the feasts, the Sabbath. And it even says, if you remember in Deuteronomy 6, if your children ask you, why are we doing this? You tell them the story. So even today with the Sabbath or the Passover, Jewish families repeat the story. So they are able to kind of maintain kind of a cultural story because the repetition of the history is part of the fabric of their faith and of their life. And I think that's something we can learn from. Otherwise, we become the Egyptians, basically.
I wonder whether we can kind of transfer the question to a different level. I know that in your book, The Bible and the Borders, you have this line, perhaps migration is part of the human DNA. And I wonder whether it's some kind of inherent nostalgia of kind of a paradise lost. No matter where we go and settle to live, we will always have that feeling of being not quite there. Whether we can add something like some of that. But we have a couple of more questions, and I know we are running out of time. So one question that has received 2 likes goes like this: could you please give us an insight of how the Holy Spirit, His presence, shapes the narratives of migration? Many thanks.
I'm thinking the Old Testament, you won't have the role of the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament like you would in the New Testament. I'd say 2 things, though, very quickly. In the Old Testament, the hope in Jeremiah of the new covenant is that the law would be placed in their hearts. And so those of us, who are new covenant people as Christians, part of that law was how to treat the foreigner. So I think the idea of the Old Testament is that that law would become part of the people of God with all of what it meant for, let's say, in this topic, migration, but now empowered by the Holy Spirit. Okay. Now, when you get to the New Testament, there's neither Jew nor Greek. And there's only one baptism and one Spirit that unites us all. So I think what you would find is that the Holy Spirit should empower not only the compassion toward the foreigner, okay, but also the idea that of appreciating different believers from different contexts as part of the body of Christ. Now, when we go to the epistles, we find that cultures are clashing. I mean, this is what Paul is dealing with. Even Peter in Galatians chapter 1 and 2, Paul has to correct Peter because he's falling into his cultural patterns of not wanting to engage the Gentile. And so Paul says, no, that's not true. There is no Jew nor Greek in Christ. And so I think the Holy Spirit can empower us not only to do the compassion, but also have a different framework of how to see and look at the foreigner. Can I mention something that I wanted to mention in the talk that I forgot? So this is unrelated to the question, but it's very, very, very important. It's not only that the Bible, I'm an Old Testament guy, so a lot of Old Testament talks about migration. But the point that I want to say is this, and this is important for your institute, Eastern European Institute, is that the Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament with the epistles, is largely born and written in exile, in diaspora. So what you find, and this is what we need to get immigrant communities realizing, that some of the richest theological truth is revealed in exile and in diaspora. The diaspora, the exile becomes a place where God manifests himself in unique and special ways. And I think we need to appreciate the contribution of the diaspora to the Bible and to Christian theology. We need to just reorient, so it's not like, helping diaspora Christians, but empowering diaspora Christians to begin to contribute, as they always have done, to the theology of the church.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've been asked to finish before 10:30, before 5:30 Kiev time, so we are really running out of time. And I know at the end, just a curiosity question. From one of your interviews, I know that you enjoy reading mystery novels. Is there a novel that combines the themes of mystery and immigration that you really liked and can recommend?
Well, the thing is I like murder mysteries.
Okay, well.
So, what you have, anyway, I like murder mysteries. Okay, so
Good.
that doesn't really help with immigration. But I read a lot of Latin American literature in Spanish, and in English too. But you have a lot of stories in this country of people migrating to the U.S.
Okay.
And there's one, and also some reporting. And there's a title of a book. I'm looking over here. Where is it? I don't see it. Anyway, my migration stuff's over to my left. But the title of the book, in English, when they translated as the title is The Beast. The Beast is this railroad that goes through Mexico up to the border. So and people jump on the train and they try to come up to the border. And the train is called La Bestia, or The Beast. And but that's not the title in Spanish. In Spanish, and I read it in Spanish. And of course, here I am looking for it and I can't find it. But it's over here. Here it is. This is the title in Spanish. In English, it's The Beast. It's about the train. But in Spanish, the original title is Los Migrantes que no importan. The immigrants that have no value.
Oh.
That's a powerful title because it's all the suffering of the migration, because their life doesn't really mean much to anybody else. Los migrantes que no importan. And so that would be a book that really impacted me. Because there's a lot of sad stories about coming north.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll. Many people have expressed their thanks, in the chat room. So Alicant said, thank you so much, Dr. Carroll. It's been a moment of great insight. God bless you. So I join the sentiment. So thank you so much again for joining us, Summer School of Theology. May God bless you in your, continued research on the Bible and immigration. And God bless you and your family, your kids, your grandchildren. God bless you, brother.
Thank you, and I'm following Ukraine, and may the Lord bless you, and may this war end in the way it should.